They had promised each other, in one way or another, over the slow burn of years and the quick shocks of small crises, that the house would stay. It was more than nails and paint to them. It was ledger and lullaby, a ledger of birthdays and scraped knees, a map of where secrets had been tucked under the mattress and promises left in kitchen drawers. The house sat on a short, crooked street where the elms made long, damp shadows in spring, and where the late sunlight fell through the upstairs window on the yellow wallpaper that had been there since before anyone could remember. The wallpaper that loosened in one corner like a smile that had grown tired. It had been built by a grandfather who arrived with 2 trunks and a determination, who set bricks with calloused hands and hung the porch swing where afternoons were measured in the creak of a rope and the smell of brewing coffee. For Mara, the youngest of the 3 children, it was where she learned to thread her first sweater on the cold kitchen table. For Jonah, the middle child, and once the most practical, it was the one place that smelled of his father's pipe tobacco and his mother's lemon soap. For Claire, the eldest and the most resolute, it was the altar of family history where a woman could call upon lineage like a talisman. When their mother, Lydia, who had kept the house and the family to an almost holy standard of persistence, fell ill and a hospital bed became the new centerpiece of the living room, the question that had lived in the background like a hummed radio finally stepped forward. Keep the house. Keep the house. It was a question that read simple on paper, but that, when spoken out loud in the fluorescent glare of a palliative ward and then again across a chipped kitchen table, summoned things they had never named to each other: unpaid medical bills. Quote, Jonah's layoffs and subsequent contract work that paid in bursts. Claire's mortgage on a condo uptown bought when she thought distance meant safety. Mara's quiet bank balance and the way her hands shook when she reached for the kettle. Money is a blunt instrument. Memory is a broadsword. Either way, something was going to be cut. The siblings convened meetings like court hearings, emails, a hastily arranged Saturday brunch, a lawyer's office where words like estate and equity sat with clinical calm while they tried to be anything but clinical. At first, the arguments wore the clothes of logistics, market value, the cost of renovations, the projections of a realtor who smiled and used phrases like turnkey and buyer pool. But the house has a way in those rooms soaked with years of making logistics look like betrayal. Jonah remembered lying on the back lawn at 14, the sky a paper thrown over the headaches of being a boy, and his father's hand finding his hair and the whispered, unarguable promise that this place would be his refuge. Claire remembered a promise of continuity made with their mother when she stood in the kitchen at 19, a battered frying pan in her hands, and said, solemn as a priest, that she would always bring meals home to the table where the lamp hummed like a tired heart. Mara remembered closets full of dresses and a smell of almonds from pastries. Small things that, in the arithmetic of grief, became the ledger that no accountant could balance. When the siblings sat at the table and tried to speak as if their words were neutral currency, grief intruded different, jagged, personal. Claire's insistence on keeping the house felt to Jonah like an insistence on remaining small. She equated selling with conceding defeat to the slow, inevitable erosion of what they had been. Jonah's pragmatic leaning toward selling looked to Claire like a readiness to trade memory for mobility. He had young children of his own and could not imagine carrying the weight of a house that needed more than nostalgia to survive. Mara, the quiet one, wanted neither to own the house nor to be the agent of its sale. She wanted that the house remain as proof that their mother had not been erased by illness. And Lydia, when she was lucid, would press her thin hand to the wallpaper and say things like, houses hold us the way we hold a letter. She wanted the house kept. But she also, in a fleeting moment of honesty, admitted to Jonah that she was tired of dusting for ghosts. Money matters arrived in envelopes and spreadsheets, and obscene balances revealed late at night, secrets, father's unpaid loans concealed in a shoebox under a floorboard, the revelation of a long-ago plea bargain to keep mortgage payments afloat, came like rain, unexpected and wet with perpetual consequences. The siblings, once a cell of shared jokes and coordinated defenses against the world, began to fracture along lines they had not seen because the fissures were under the house, not in it. Claire interpreted Jonah's suggestion to sell as a reproach. You never wanted to keep it. You left years ago. Now you decide? Jonah, whose life had been smoothed into the present with careful payments and grim resolve, heard Claire's rebuttals as performative sanctimony, as if she were claiming a martyrdom she had not earned. Mara watched them at the edges and felt like a physical ache, the betrayal of being forced to choose in the middle of mourning. The legal meeting was the day history became headline. The lawyer explained the will in calm, neutral phrases that felt like knockers on the door of a room they were no longer allowed into. The house, by default, belonged to the estate. The estate belonged to them as heir. But the law, with its neat columns, did not account for the stubbornness of memory. You can keep it, the lawyer said, if you can agree on management and share expenses. And what was said as solution fell apart because agreements require trust. And trust had been eroded. And eroded. There were votes and vetoes, a mechanic's ledger of who would pay for the roof repairs, who would tend the garden in spring, who would move their life a few miles east. The arguments grew personal fast. Claire confronted Jonah in a torrent of old grievances, that he had left when a refusal to choose felt like freedom, that he had chosen other cities, other partners, other lives. Jonah retorted with the wounds of responsibility, that he had kept bringing money home in times of crisis, that he had made sacrifices no one acknowledged. In Mara's kitchen, while Lydia slept and the house's tick and drip persevered, neighbors started to notice. The Alvarez family across the street remembered the children's laughter and the way Lydia would bake bread and give half loaves to anyone who had nothing. After the arguments became regular, after doors were slammed and words spoken that could not be unsaid, the neighborhood's gentle question, "What will happen to that house?" hardened into gossip. The realtor, sensing urgency and the smell of opportunity, called with her polite cadence and market updates and, finally, a figure. A price that made some of their burdens look smaller, a pile of cash that could pay medical bills, clear mortgages, buy new starts for 2 of them. Money does not annul memory, but it rearranges it into something else. The offer sat on the kitchen table like a foreign object. Claire could see, in the sheen of possibility, the means to keep some control, a way to buy herself time. Jonah could see the hospital bills shrink to a manageable number. Mara could imagine a trip, perhaps a small retreat, the kind of softening that grief sometimes requires. They could divide the proceeds, they thought, like a treaty, by one another's silence and keep the stamps of hurt tucked in envelopes. But which stamps mattered? When Claire learned that a buyer wanted to remodel the house and paint over the wallpaper, she felt a physical convulsion. The house was not simply wood. The wallpaper held their mother's handwriting, faint traces of messages left in pencil for birthdays and recipes. Selling to her felt like an erasure, a public amputation. Jonah heard her and, misinterpreting the depth of her plea, accused her of selfishness. "You want a museum," he said, "and we need a bank account." The shouting match in the kitchen fractured something irrevocable, the slamming of words, the dramatic flinging of a photograph of their parents that landed face down on the floor. In the weeks that followed, they navigated a series of small betrayals that felt disproportionate because the stakes were all memory and the means of its survival. Claire secretly called Lydia's physician to ask whether hospice could be extended if the house was kept in a certain condition. Jonah, feeling cornered and resentful, met with the realtor and asked what the absolute maximal offer might be. Mara, left in the middle, made lists and meditated late at night by the porch light. The house became a chessboard, and their strategies were exhausted and thin. The ultimate break came not from a single dramatic act, but from the slow accrual of small ones. An unsigned check that bounced. A tenant's notice that the upstairs room could no longer be rented. A mechanic's lien that made keeping the house impractical. Claire, furious and tired, demanded a vote. Jonah, seeing the math, voted to sell. Mara abstained and then, under pressure, cast the deciding vote in favor of selling because she could not bear to watch her siblings destroy themselves over plaster and timber. The vote should have been a procedural step. Instead, it was a funeral for the way they had been together. When the auction signs went up, neighbors stood and watched as strangers came to take measurements and ask questions about the attic and the cellar and older fixtures. The house that had held birthdays and bad weather, and secret lovers and quiet reconciliation now smelled of timber and new paint and the small antiseptic of contracts. On the day the moving truck arrived, Lydia was in a hospice bed, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of lemon soap. Her eyes, when she opened them and looked at the packed boxes, were not accusing so much as weighing. "I didn't want to be the thing that made you choose," she said, and there was a softness there that broke their anger into something that resembled sorrow. Claire tried to take photographs of the rooms as they were, but the light was wrong, the lens too narrow. Jonah watched from the stoop with his children playing with a box. Their laughter made the scene less like a tragedy and more like a life continuing anyway. When the house finally changed hands, the new owners brought their own history. A young couple who loved the idea of old wood and potential, who painted the yellow wallpaper a pale, neutral tone and installed a modern kitchen island. The porch swing was removed and replaced with a bench. The scent of cookie baking that had been a family signifier became once again just the smell of food in someone else's home. Time, relentless as rent, changed things. The siblings, adrift and resentful, tried to stitch the wound closed with calls and holiday visits that felt formal and obligatory. Claire stopped sending recipes. Jonah stopped attending family dinners. Mara sent postcards from a trip she had finally taken with some of the money she had been promised but never fully felt she had earned. Lydia died the following spring. The funeral was small and the eulogy was careful, filled with the kind of love that is safe to say aloud. At the cemetery afterwards, Claire stood a little apart and watched Jonah fold paper hands around his child's cold fingers. Years passed, and when Mara returned one autumn to drive past the house, the bench glinted in new varnish and the curtains were different. A small sapling had replaced the tree she used to climb as a child. The house, staunch and silent, had survived but had become other people's shelter. The siblings met once more by accident at a grocery store. They spoke in sentences that did not re-traumatize but did not heal either. In quiet moments, each of them would think of the wallpaper and the way it once held a message in a child's handwriting. "Forgive Dad?" Scratched faintly under a shelf. They knew then that it had never been only about the house. It had been about who owned the right to memory and who could be allowed to live in the story of their family. The choice to sell had not merely moved property. It had redistributed grief and in doing so had reweighed how they belonged to each other. Over time, the sharp edges dull. They learned to speak differently or to speak less. Sometimes at odd hours, Jonah would take his child past the old street and point to the house and tell a simpler story. That family is something you carry, whether you keep a house or not. Claire, on her own balcony with the city light blurring like a low constellation, would think of the wallpaper and bake something she used to bake with Lydia. She would then box it. Mara, who had voted to sell and who carried that choice like an unlisted scar, found herself, years later, sitting in a different house in a living room with a different smell and realizing that memory is not a thing to be preserved behind glass but a practice. Telling the story again and again, even when it stinks. In the end, the house had broken them in a practical sense and, in a less obvious way, had forced a reckoning that only grief can press upon people, the knowledge that love entrusted to structures and promises requires constant tending, and that when the tenderers falter, choices will be made that no one can reverse. The real ache was not the loss of the wood or the wallpaper, but the fracture in the quiet mutuality that once assumed that the other would always be there. And the way, after the sale, every family holiday became a negotiation, every reunion a tabletop over which old ledgers were balanced anew. If there is a tenderness in the story, it is small. Visits that are not required but happen anyway. Letters left in drawers. A recipe copied in a shaky hand. A photograph found in a pocket that makes the living feel less singular. They are still siblings, shaped indelibly by the same glue of childhood and the same mortar of shared years, but the house that could have been the place where they repaired themselves instead became the fulcrum that tipped them into who they are now. Separate, sometimes reconciled, always remembering that promises like walls must be maintained or else they will crumble, and the rubble will tell the rest of the tale.